All right, we're going to get the show on the road. Thank you all for coming today. We are going to learn about space law in the future. We are very fortunate to have a special guest, Mr. Sagi Kfir, who is General Counsel and Vice President of Regulatory Affairs, one of the co-founders of Deep Space Industries, Inc. As we're going to learn, this is a company that is providing technical resources, capabilities, and system integration required to discover, harvest, process, and market in space resources. He has a lot of expertise in litigation, commercial transactions. In the aerospace industry, he's represented Fortune 500 companies as a law firm associate in Miami, Florida. When he came here to San Diego, he was general counsel for a national aviation company. I guess he wanted to keep the company name secret, right? Okay. A national aviation company for 11 years. And now, as I said, he's now one of the co-founders and general counsel for Deep Space Industries. He's also working closely with government, with the U.S. administration, Congress, various federal agencies on regulatory matters pertaining to the commercial space industry, and he's going to talk about that. He was directly involved in the passage of the Commercial Space Launch Competitiveness Act of 2015, which granted U.S. citizens, us, rights to materials extracted from space resources. Sagi also contributes his time to non-profit space organizations that promote the development of human spaceflight and exploration, such as the New World Institute. If you want to follow in his footsteps, he holds a Juris Doctorate with honors from the University of Miami and a Bachelor of Arts from Johns Hopkins University, and is licensed to practice law in California and in Florida, and shortly in space, I'm sure. So let's give a warm welcome for Mr. Sagi Kfir.
Yeah, that was a big title. I have to say the proudest part of my life is actually working for Deep Space Industries, which is an asteroid mining company. So 5 years ago when we started the company, we talked about asteroid mining. Most people thought that I was insane and probably offered me some kind of medication or a drug to take. That was the reaction that I got. And the second question was, you mean like Bruce Willis in Armageddon? And I said, no, actually not like Bruce Willis in Armageddon. It's all robotic. So let's start a little bit of a video presentation, and then I'll jump into it and explain further.
All right.
What will tomorrow look like? Our world is at its limits, and yet we all want more. And why not? Why shouldn't the future be brighter than today? But where will it come from? Simple. Our tiny planet sits in a vast sea of resources, including millions of asteroids bathed in the sun's free energy 24 hours a day. The same rocks that could fall from our skies also contain everything we could ever need, both out there and down here. It's time someone seized the opportunity. Deep Space Industries. Deep Space is a new kind of company with a new kind of plan. We don't build rockets, we don't do astronomy. We are explorers and harvesters, makers and suppliers. As they say, timing is everything, and for space, right now is that time. In fact, some of the planet's most successful people are placing their bets on this new frontier. Meanwhile, NASA and others are planning new missions to the Moon and Mars, and new space facilities in free space, joining the billions of dollars worth of communication satellites already in orbit. And as they reach beyond Earth orbit, Deep Space Industries will be there with the fuel, air, and materials they need to succeed and grow. DSI has assembled an international team of well-known experts and young innovators who are building our space legacy and creating new technologies and approaches to open the frontier. We will develop and prove ourselves in 3 areas: exploring and prospecting for asteroids, harvesting and returning asteroid materials, processing those materials for use in space and on Earth. Our early systems will be small and largely off-the-shelf components re-engineered for deep space. We will hitch rides on much larger missions with multiple ways to get into space, where our job really begins. With mission costs so low, we will be able to attract commercial sponsors and build fleets of vehicles to assure our success. Early markets will be satellites in need of fuel, government outposts and commercial facilities, and missions between the Earth and the Moon. As we gain experience and develop our systems, we will grow them as the frontier grows, so that when the time comes, DSI will be ready. We will be the gas station, the oasis for air and water, and the building supply center for the frontier. This is a long game, perhaps the longest ever. While we'll earn our way, the long goal is to create a better future for all of us through space resources. When the first asteroid is mined, deep space will be there. When the first space power plants come online, deep space will be there. When the first space colonies are built, deep space will be there. We can have it all. We can have an amazing future. The resources of space will lead to a renaissance both in space and back here on our precious Mother Earth. We are deep space. The frontier is coming, and our time is now.
Thank you, Professor Blanco, for inviting me. Thank you, everybody, for being here. Thank you for inviting me on the hottest day of the year. I really appreciate that. So we're going to talk a little bit about asteroids and space resources and the audacity to think that we can actually do this. So that video is a little bit of a hard act to follow. And there's a lot of material that I want to cover. So I'm going to go a little bit, I'm going to go fairly quickly, and we'll save the end for a Q&A, because I hope there's a lot of questions. Here's what it's going to look like today. I want to talk a little bit about the commercial industry in space and the limits that that commercial industry has in terms of being able to expand beyond low Earth orbit. And I want to talk about how space resources can help us expand beyond low Earth orbit and actually benefit mankind. The question is this legal? Can we actually mine space resources? And after that, I want to show you a little bit of a peek into the future. So this is what humanity's participation in space was like 60 years plus 3 weeks ago. That was the human touch in space. Actually nothing. And this is what it was 60 years plus 2 weeks ago. Anybody know what this picture is? Sputnik. First artificial satellite in space by the Soviet Union. It was about yay big. That was the first time we put anything in space. And then, only 12 years later, mankind last landed on a different celestial body. So that was 48 years ago. So I had one of my nephews ask me, he said, Sagi, is it really true that when you were born, there were men on the moon? And, all right, so I feel a little dated. Yes, there were men on the moon when I was born. And actually, the last man on the moon walked the moon about 7 months after I was born, in 1972. And humans have not left low Earth orbit since that time. That was 48 years ago. And in 48 years ago, we put people on the moon with technology, with less technology of all of the US computers put together than what you have on your cell phone today. That's the audacity that we had 48 years ago. But we haven't done much since. And in fact, we're actually starting right now as humans to wake up to the possibilities of space. Do you know how many flights the Wright brothers took with a glider before they actually did a powered flight, for the first powered flight ever? They did more than 700 glider flights. We've done less than 500 space flights since the beginning of human touch into space. So we haven't even started our exploration of space. And up until recently, all of the activity generally in space were done by space agencies. Anybody know the reason for that?
It's expensive.
Very expensive. It's very expensive. So the space race, if you've heard of the space race in the 60s and how we got people on the moon, it's because there was a lot of prestige behind it. It was the Soviets and the US against each other. And there was a race. And it took a lot of money. In fact, NASA's budget during the Apollo mission, the missions that went to the moon, was about 4% of the gross domestic product of the United States. That's a lot of money. Today, NASA's budget is much less than 1%. So it took a lot of money to get there. And the technology was very primitive at the time. So that's how it's generally been. Anybody know what this is?
International Space Station.
International Space Station. The most expensive human venture ever. $150 billion that about 15 countries have put together. And it's still around. And it's still going to be around until 2024 and maybe even later. But that's generally been the domain of governments and space agencies. Something happened, something shifted. And today we have the rise of private industry. We had private industry before in space. Communication satellites, remote sensing. But that was very limited in relation to what governments and the military were putting in space. Something changed about 10 years ago, plus or minus. Anyone ever hear of a CubeSat? A CubeSat is the miniaturization of satellites. So Moore's law tells us that every 18 months, technology changes as such that we can double the power of computing power or transistors and in a smaller amount of space. So technology changed where now you can miniaturize spacecraft into something like this. Now, they're not going to be as robust as a spacecraft that might be the size of this podium, but still you can now create satellites that are this small, that are just a fraction of the price of what satellites used to be. That's what we call CubeSats. And what's also happened is what's something called the democratization of space. Because CubeSats are so cheap to make, you have universities making satellites. You have private industry now creating satellites. So now the private industry is arising because of the miniaturization of these spacecraft. And another thing changed. It's called hitching ride to space. So once upon a time, this entire satellite right here, you can see the people, just to give you a little bit of a perspective on how large this is. The entire rocket would be dedicated just to one major satellite. But with the miniaturization of satellites, you could put smaller satellites right next to it and they hitch a ride. So now you can have universities and you can have private companies sending their own spacecraft for a fraction of the price going to space. So the number of spacecraft has increased dramatically. Anyone ever hear of Elon Musk? I'm sure, right? So he created a company called, other than Tesla and other than solar companies and PayPal, SpaceX. So SpaceX is a private rocket company. And he's disrupted the market by lowering the costs of rockets, increasing the capability, and companies like Deep Space can now put their spacecraft, hitch a ride with a larger spacecraft, with a larger satellite, put it right on the bottom, and now go to space. So he's revolutionized, he's disrupted the industry, and now there's more capacity. The commercial industry is now growing to $330 billion. A fraction, or it's just a fraction of what it can be, but it's a dramatic increase from the last 10 years. And startups are actually getting involved in space. Startups that are doing what's called non-traditional space activity. So once upon a time, it was just several things that you could do as a private company. You can put a satellite up to do communications, or you could put a satellite up to do what's called remote sensing, a satellite that takes pictures of the Earth. Now there's a rise of an industry called the non-traditional space activities, like asteroid mining, like on-orbit servicing spacecraft, servicing satellites. That's never been done before. Tugs, where you're actually pushing a satellite from one orbit to another. Inflatable habitats, space habitats in space. So there's this rise of the non-traditional space activities. And this is what's really driving the commercial industry more than anything else. Your cell phone. Everyone's on social media. Everyone's on Facebook. Everyone wants to know what's going on in the world because there's this insatiable hunger for data. The military uses it. We use it. Airlines use it. everything revolves now around satellites and communications and relays with satellites. So we need more and more satellites for more and more data, more data consumption. This is what I call the B Club, the Billionaire Boy Club. And unfortunately, right now, it's still the Billionaire Boy Club. These are the people that are getting involved in the commercial space industry. You might recognize some of these faces. Elon Musk, I told you about. Anyone know who Jeff Bezos is? Amazon? Pretty obvious. He's got his own space company called Blue Origin. Richard Branson, Virgin Galactic, they're going to take space tourists up in the next couple of years. For a $200,000 flight, you can buy a ticket to go for 5 minutes in suborbital space and come down. There are people that already bought these tickets. Paul Allen, co-founder of Microsoft, also has his own space company called Stratolaunch. And then Bigelow, who's creating inflatable habitats. These are all billionaires that are getting involved because they see the potential, plus they're big space fanatics. So how's deep space industry involved in this? What's deep space industry's role? So DSI is creating small spacecraft, miniaturizing spacecraft that not only are we selling into low Earth orbit that people can use for communications, for remote sensing, but for something else. There has been 0 private companies in deep space. No commercial company has ever left Earth's orbit, whether it's low Earth orbit or geosynchronous orbit. No private company has ever gone beyond Earth's orbit. Why is that important? Our mission is to explore, utilize, and settle space. That's what deep space industry was founded for. And how are we going to do that? Well, I think we gave it away with the video, that it's going to be through asteroids and space resources. So we were talking about this commercial industry that's growing in low Earth orbit and beyond. These miniaturization of satellites, they're now creating what's called constellations of satellites, where they put not just one of these small spacecraft. They'll put hundreds of these small spacecraft autonomously working together. Now, the average life of a satellite in geosynchronous orbit is about 10 to 12 years. Anyone know why that's the approximate time for nearly all the satellites?
The orbital decay.
The orbital decay is one reason, but what's the problem with orbital decay in these satellites?
They'll come crashing down to Earth if they're not put up in a higher orbit after a while.
And how do they stay in a higher orbit?
Fuel. They have to get boosted.
Fuel. They run out of fuel. They're perfectly good working satellites, but they just run out of fuel because they're constantly using fuel to stay in orbit. So you've got hundreds of satellites that are perfectly operable satellites. They just ran out of fuel. So what they do is they take those satellites, and for the last bit of fuel that they have, they put them in what's called in a graveyard orbit. And they're all just sitting there. A whole bunch of satellites are sitting there doing absolutely nothing because they ran out of fuel. So there's a huge demand for fuel for all these satellites, and there's more and more satellites that are going to be put online. And there's a need for supplies to go into deep space. So there is a demand. We know there's a short-term demand for refueling satellites. We know that they're going to need that any human activity beyond low Earth orbit is going to need water. It's going to need air. And then as humanity starts increasing its activity in space, the problem is there's no gravity. And you can't stay there. All the studies that they've been doing with astronauts show that there's a real fast deterioration of the human body, the bone structure, of the muscle mass, when there's no gravity. So in order for humans to live and work in space for a long time, there's going to be a time where if you do it for a longer period of time, you have to have gravity in order to sustain your health. And at the end of the day, you're going to need some kind of recreation. You're going to need some kind of activity, some kind of nature in order to stay healthy and happy in space. So where do we get that supply? You know it's asteroids, but I'm going to talk to you about it pretty soon. So why not take it from Earth? Let's just take all these resources and build stuff in space from Earth. What's the major problem with that? Is there an economics class in here? It costs about $11,000 per pound of mass to lift into Earth. So when we talk about developing space for humanity, we're really talking about developing these large space structures. We're talking about antennas, arrays on satellites that are kilometers in length. We're talking about building structures that are kilometers in length. So if you had to lift it up from Earth, you'd never be able to make a business case for it because it's $11,000 per pound. So it's not economically sustainable. Here are the numbers just for your understanding on what that looks like. The farther you take out the resource from Earth, the more expensive it is because you need more fuel on the rocket to take it out. So just to go on the lunar surface, it's about 100 million to 1 billion. It's a huge range. It depends on what you're taking per ton. This is what it looks like. If you filled a pool full of water, that in space is going to be $800 million worth of water. This bucket loader is going to be about $80 million. Nobody can make a business case to bring that amount of material into space to build large space structures for humans. It just doesn't work. How much stuff can you put on a rocket? So when you look at a rocket, half of it is fuel, if not the majority of the fuel. And the spacecraft is just in the tip of here, in the tip of the rocket. That's the usable part of the spacecraft. Everything else is a rocket that either falls apart or, with the help of SpaceX, we now have reusable first stage rockets that actually land. They come back and land on Earth, which is shocking, because do you know that most of the rockets, up until SpaceX developed reusable rockets last year when it started happening? Do you know what happened to the rockets?
They fall into orbit and they burn.
They fall into orbit and they burn. Part of it burns, the majority falls into the ocean. There's a whole graveyard in the South Pacific, generally, that area, where imagine if you were flying to England and the 747 that you were on afterwards, they dumped it in the ocean every time. It just wouldn't make it economically feasible. So Elon Musk has revolutionized the space industry by now using these rockets once again. But you can only put so much material into a rocket. So you're volume constrained. You can't bring up that much material in space. So the idea is really local use with local resources. That's how we've done it on Earth. That's how we're going to do it in space. In fact, if you look around you, this building wasn't built because we hauled timber and cement from Mother England. Okay? Most of the cement comes locally, from local what do we call them?
Quarries.
Quarries. That shows my foreign accent. I apologize for that. So where do we get these resources? One place is asteroids. So you're thinking, an asteroid, well, that looks like, that just looks like a dead piece of rock. What can you get from an asteroid? Asteroids have every single thing you need to survive in outer space, other than food. But you can grow food from an asteroid. They've got water. They've got minerals. They've got silicates. They've got metals, what we call PGMs, platinum group metals, like platinum, like iridium, that are rare on Earth. And they've got all sorts of volatiles. The good thing about asteroids is what we look for are called NEAs. Anyone know what an NEA stands for? Near-Earth asteroid. Thank you. Appreciate that. So the near-Earth asteroids, when we say near-Earth, we talk about anywhere between 0 to 1.8 astronomical units away. An astronomical unit is the distance between the Earth and the Sun. So anywhere between 1.8 and lower is called a near-Earth object or an asteroid, NEO or NEA. And the great thing about them is that they sometimes come between the Earth and the Moon, or right near cislunar space, right near the space between the Earth and the Moon. And when you land on them, because there's very little gravity to no gravity, depending on the size of the asteroid, you can easily take off from the asteroid, as opposed to going, let's say, landing on the Moon, where you want to get resources from the Moon, which is a different subject. We can talk about that later. But you need a lot of energy to lift off from the Moon. You don't need that amount of energy to get off of an asteroid. So they're easy targets for resources in space. So what can you do with water? So water you can use to drink, right? You can process the water from the volatiles, and astronauts can use it to drink. You can also split water and have hydrogen and oxygen. Oxygen you can use to breathe, and hydrogen you can use for fuel, and oxygen you can use for rocket fuel. In fact, Deep Space Industries has a rocket that, or thrusters, very small thrusters, for these CubeSats that we were talking about, that use just water. We call them the flying steam kettles. It's never been done before. There's no commercial company out there selling it. And we've already sold it, and we're going to have 3 spacecraft using our thruster systems in, I think it's March to April, whenever the window is for the launch window for the SpaceX rocket that's going to take these 3 spacecraft. So you can use water, obviously, for all those purposes. And it's easy to transport. It's actually the lowest hanging fruit. So nearly 40+% of an asteroid, many types of asteroids, are full of water. And they have tons of metals. And you can use these metals for all sorts of things. Anyone ever hear of a 3D printer? Yes. So now there's a company called Made in Space. And Made in Space actually has a printer for space, right? That it doesn't need gravity in order to make 3D printed material. So you can use a lot of the material from asteroids. You can process it, put it into an additive manufacturing machine, like a 3D printer, and you can create these large solar arrays. You can create larger antennas. You can make satellites a lot more powerful. And you can build widgets. You can build structures using those metals. There's also what we call PGMs, the platinum group metals that I was talking to you about, that are rare on Earth. In fact, 1 in 4 of the technologies, the products that you use today uses PGM. And they're very limited resources because they're heavy metals. So the PGMs originally that when Earth was created sunk down just like gold and titanium and all those heavier metals. And the PGMs that we actually have in our phones and that we're actually using, we're actually asteroid miners already. The Earth doesn't create platinum group metals. It doesn't create gold. That wasn't created by the Earth. It was created by very explosive events in the solar system where 2 suns would collide together. That's how gold is made. And when the Earth was formed, all that gold, all those heavy metals sunk into Earth, and then it hardened. So the gold and the platinum, all those things that we access because asteroids contain them, and they crashed into Earth. So we're already mining asteroids to begin with. All the materials that you have, 1 in 4 of the materials you have, is because of some asteroid. And then satellite propellant. We were talking about all these satellites that need to be refueled. If you can just extend the life of one communication satellite for a year, that company can increase its revenue by $50 to $100 million, depending on the type of satellite it is and depending on what communications they're doing, who they're selling it to, the military, civilian. It's across the board. But think about it. These satellite companies, these satellite operators that have these assets in space are putting all these assets in a junkyard orbit that they can't use ever again, or they're not thinking about using ever again. And if you extend it by 1 year, they can make an additional $100 million. The question is, what is it worth to them? So we already received a letter of what's called a letter of intent by ULA. ULA is a space company. It's a large defense company that's put together between Boeing and Lockheed. And they told us, if you bring back material that we can, or that you can process and sell to us, we'll pay you $300 million per ton. That's a lot of money. Now, whether that happens or it doesn't happen is not the point. The point is, there's already recognition within the space industry that space resources are something that companies need in order to expand. And ultimately, this is going to be about human settlements. Everyone know, or anyone here, that Elon Musk wants to go to Mars and live on Mars? Yeah. That's not going to be possible without space resources. Jeff Bezos wants to do the same. You actually need those local resources in order to allow humanity to develop these structures. People tell me, well, okay, Sagi, you're talking about asteroids and you're talking about asteroid material in my cell phone. Why can't we just get these resources? Why can't we find these resources on Earth? So this is, right here, this is what used to be part of an asteroid. Anyone know what this is called today?
Meteorite?
Meteorite. So there's actually no asteroid material on Earth. A pure asteroid, to see what an asteroid looks like, there's only been 3 missions throughout history to go to an asteroid. And they've all been done by space agencies because they're multi-billion-dollar missions. So the only one that's ever returned a little bit of an asteroid material is from the Japanese space agency called JAXA. And you know how much material they returned? Less than a gram. A couple of flakes of an asteroid. That's how complicated it is. deep space industry just created a platform, a satellite, a spacecraft that actually can go to a satellite, or to go to an asteroid, take 10 kilos worth of asteroid material and bring it back to Earth. There's a whole business for those in the economics class. There's an entire business to be had just by the science community that wants to get their hands on these asteroid materials to see what the building blocks of asteroids are really all about. We just have an inkling of an idea. This is the estimated guess of what the space resource economy could be. There's an estimation between members of the industry and those that we know would buy these supplies, including space agencies, including private companies that would want these supplies to refuel their satellites, that within 2023, around 5 to 6 years, we're looking about $600 million worth of potential revenue from resources from space, preferably from asteroids in particular. Anywhere to $1.5 billion by 2029. These are just rough estimates. But this is something that's already talked about within the industry in terms of the potential of the industry itself, in terms of the money that could be had. So where are these asteroids? How many are there? How close are they? So these are all near-Earth asteroids, what we talked about, NEAs. If you could see the size on the left, that's the size of the asteroids. That's the size of the NEAs that we know of. Today, in 2017, we're almost in 2018, this is a little bit dated, it's a couple of years old, we know of millions of NEAs. Millions. And that number increases every single day we find more asteroids. Anywhere between a 10,000 meter asteroid, which is 10 kilometers, that would destroy an entire civilization over several times, all the way to a 1 meter asteroid that there's 250 million that are estimated. And everywhere in between. Now, so how much material can you get, let's say, from a 500 meter asteroid? On a 500 meter asteroid, with the technology that we have today, and for the next 20, 30 years, it would take probably 100 years to use one particular asteroid. So the amount of material, although you have a limited number, is really limitless in terms of its potential. And these are just the ones that we know of today. That number is increasing in terms of the numbers that we're finding, these NEAs. It's a little dated, it's about the end of 2016. But that number is increasing from about 250 million, 2,500,000, I apologize, 2,500,000 to about 4 million today. There's also another benefit of learning how to deal with asteroids and getting to asteroids. It's called planetary protection. Maybe this is not the particular image of what destroyed the dinosaurs, but just ask the dinosaurs how well their asteroid detection and deflection program worked for them, right? Didn't really work that well. The same science that we're using to get to an asteroid is the same science that we can use to deflect an asteroid that's coming to Earth. That's planetary protection. There are many more benefits that we could talk about from going out and learning how to deal with space resources. So is there any law out there? Is there any law out there that addresses space resources and whether it's legal or not? Can we do this? Space law, when you go into a law library, if anyone's ever been to a law library and you're walking down the halls of a law library, you'll see stacks and stacks and stacks of books. Contracts and HR and real estate and transactions and a lot of other things. And when you go to the space law section, it's about 4 books. It's like this big. And the reason for that is because generally space law has been the domain of governments and military agencies and a couple of private companies doing, like I said, remote sensing and communications. Now that's changing. So when they developed space laws back in the 60s, and since then, they really weren't thinking about asteroid mining. That wasn't part of people's perception. So today's space law is really built upon, the foundation's really built upon some treaties in the United Nations and some domestic law. And not every nation has its own space law. There's, we've got 193 nations that are part of the United Nations, right? Only about 12 or 13 have actually been space-faring nations. They've had the ability to go to space. The rest have not, at least not independently. So many of them don't even have their own domestic space law, but they follow international space law. So it's a combination of UN treaties, your own domestic law, customary law, the practices that nations that have been in space are doing, and that becomes customary law. But what's the primary goal of space law? It's the rational and reasonable exploration and use of space for the freedom of all mankind, for the use of all mankind. Space is actually the only physical space, the only physical arena where, since the first treaty on space law in 1967, the Outer Space Treaty of 1967, when that was created, it's the only physical space that has never had a conflict. So real quickly, we talked about these 5 treaties in the UN. And they're all binding except for the Moon Agreement that has the little asterisk. I'm not going to go into the treaties, or I'm not going to go into any of the treaties except for one, the Outer Space Treaty. I'll tell you a little bit about it in a moment. The Moon Agreement was back in 1979 to 1984. It's the only international space law treaty that the United States did not accept. It didn't ratify. The Congress or the Senate never ratified it. And there's some geopolitical and political issues about the Moon Agreement. And in fact, the US, as a spacefaring nation, and all of the spacefaring nations actually never signed it. I'll tell you why in a minute. The most important treaty was the Outer Space Treaty of 1967. It's kind of like the Constitution of space law. It's like the Magna Carta. It's the spine of international space law. And most of the things that you need to understand are in Article 1 and Article 2 of that treaty. And Article 1 talks about the freedom for exploration and use of space for all mankind. That's in the first title, that's in the title of the first international space law and the first article of the first international space law. It talks about the freedom for use and exploration for everyone. But there's a limitation. The Article 2, the one that follows it, says, outer space is not subject to national appropriation by claim of sovereignty, by means of use or occupation, or by any other means. So it basically says, you're free to use, but you can't appropriate space or any celestial body. Anyone know why we had Article 2 in there? Because at that time, yes?
So the moon's not claimed by a country.
That's right. No colonization of space. This was all done, don't forget, in 1967, in the height of the Cold War. Right? In the height of the Cold War, with the Soviets and the US racing to the moon. Everybody was racing to the moon. And both were afraid that the other was going to get to the moon first. So they both agreed, okay, fine, no colonization. The United States actually won out. So when Neil Armstrong planted that American flag on the moon, once upon a time that would have been a stake for Mother England or for this country or that country. It was just the proverbial stake of claiming a sort of pride for the United States. But there was absolutely no legal allowance for that spot of land to be claimed to the United States. And that was because of the Outer Space Treaty and Article 2 of the Outer Space Treaty. So that basically means that no one can appropriate any celestial body. So if we land on an asteroid and take some of the asteroid, are we appropriating it? And that's been the question for 40 plus years, debated academically. But the problem was, nobody's pushed it to the limit. There's been no industry that's ever taken that and taken it into the international arena and seen if it works or not in terms of appropriation legally. So what did we do? Right? We had Article 2 that says no appropriation. So people came to me and they said, well, Sagi, could we land on an asteroid? I said, yeah, if you could technically land on an asteroid, we can land on an asteroid. Well, could we take the material? I said, well, there's nothing in international law that says you can't. But there's nothing in international law that says you can. So this was a gray area that was left open. So in the law, it basically says that under international law, if something is not explicitly prohibited, then it's allowed. So that was our argument. But the problem was, starting a company requires what? Money, right? So you go to investors and you say, got a great idea. We're going to go to asteroids, and we're going to take them apart, and we're going to create stuff in space. What do you think? So most of them thought that we were crazy. And I can tell you that nobody threw open checkbooks at us. All right? Nobody's rushing to cut a check and allow us to go and do our thing. So one of the first questions they had was, is it legal? So I was hemming and hawing and telling them exactly what I told you. It's not explicitly prohibited, but it's not necessarily allowed. So it was very clear that we had to go to Congress and talk to Congress about our dilemma and create a domestic law that basically says, under international law, the United States sees the act of exploring and utilizing space material as legal. So the United States, or any law, or any nation, has the right to define an international treaty the way it sees fit, if there's an open question about the law. And here, considering that there was no particular allowance or prohibition, it is under the purview of that nation to define how it sees that international law. And that's what the United States did. So DSI spent a lot of time in Washington, D.C. I wouldn't call lobbying, I would say educating certain congressmen and women and senators in terms of what we want to do. Because what we want to do has a direct relevance to the United States for several reasons. Number one, these are cutting-edge technologies that nobody has. And right now, the United States is the world leader in space. One of the ideas is keeping the United States as the world leader in space. There's national security issues there, because the technologies that we're creating can be used, not that we want to be used in terms of conflict, that's just the opposite, but the military is interested in some of these applications. So is NASA, for civil purposes, is interested. So for intellectual property ideas, to protect those, to protect our relevance in space, and because making money creates taxes, and the government loves when you feed its coffers. So these were all the discussions that we had with various agencies, with various staffers, and various committees within Congress that deal with space. So this was 5 years ago. I wish I could just take the flash drive out of my head and put it into every one of yours to show all the stories of all the conversations with every staffer in every dinner, that we took them out, that we had conversations with them to tell them about deep space industries and why this is important. So lo and behold, after trials and tribulations of talking to the State Department and talking to NASA and talking to the White House, there's an office in the White House called OSTP, the Office of Science, Technology, Policy. And they dictate kind of the policy of where the US is going to go, where the administration is going to go, and that trickles down to Congress in terms of science, in terms of technology. And space science, or space technology, falls under the OSTP. So we had conversations with every single attorney that you could possibly imagine within the government. And after taking this to several committees and different versions, we got what's called the Commercial Space Launch Competitiveness Act of 2015, what we call CSLA. It's a large title. And within CSLA, which many people refer to as the Space Act, there's what's called Title IV. And Title IV, within this very long act, long act that deals with a lot of things, not just space resources, there's one particular part that talks about space resources. And within that law, this is, I would say, the most important sentence that revolutionized what's happening now legally in the world about space resources. A US citizen engaged in commercial recovery of an asteroid resource or a space resource under this chapter shall be entitled to any asteroid resource or space resource obtained, including to possess, own, transport, use, and sell an asteroid resource or space resource obtained in accordance with the applicable law, including international obligations. So it's basically saying, as a US company, we will protect you under the protection of the federal government, that all of your risks and all the capital that you put in, all the time that you put in to get to an asteroid, to get to a space resource, explore it, utilize it, and remove that material from it, you can consider the federal government will protect you. This was the first law in world history that talked about the protection of space resource for a company or a citizen that's going to go out and obtain these resources. This was one small step for regulation, one giant leap for mankind. How do you think the world took this? What was anyone have an idea what the reaction throughout the world was?
They were surprised that it was even an issue.
That's definitely, that's a nice way of saying it. Yeah, that's one way. The majority of the world was actually silent. They had no idea what this is all about. What are you talking about? Asteroid recovery, space research? What are you talking about? They had no idea. So then there were some parts of the world, for geopolitical purposes, didn't like it, where they tried to push back against it, saying that this law is illegal. It's not recognized on the Outer Space Treaty. And Article 2 of the Outer Space Treaty says no appropriation. So it said, if it says no appropriation, how can you allow it? I'll get to that in a minute. So the Outer Space Treaty is a little longer than just the first two articles. There's another article within the Outer Space Treaty that's called Authorization and Continual Supervision. So right now, which federal agency would supervise us, would authorize us, would give us a license as DSI, would give us a license to go ahead and do our activities and constantly watch us throughout our activities? Which federal agency? Anyone know? Well, who in the executive branch?
Congress.
Congress is in the legislature. Anyone?
Federal Trade Commission?
Anyone else? Any ideas?
President.
Any other ideas?
Department of Commerce?
Yeah, so far you've named everybody. Anybody else? Yeah. Who? UN? No, that's international, domestically, a federal agency.
FAA for launches?
FAA, you're getting close. Anyone?
Secretary of Transportation.
Okay, so far you've named everybody. So you know who's responsible for us?
Nobody.
Nobody. Nobody's responsible for us. There is no agency within the federal government that can authorize and continually supervise an asteroid mining company. Why? Because we just came online. There's never been an asteroid mining company before. This is all brand new. So there's a problem here. The problem is that when we want to go, you have to get a launch license. You have to get a license to operate in space under the Outer Space Treaty. Why? Because Article 6 of the Outer Space Treaty says that any non-government activity in space has to be authorized and continually supervised by that state authority. So if I want to launch anyone know a company named Viasat? Yeah, it's actually a local company up in Carlsbad, and they have large satellites. Large satellites that they relay all sorts of data to the military, for commercial use, for broadband on airplanes. So they go to the federal government, and they go to the FCC, the Federal Communication Commission, and they get a license to operate communication satellites. There are other satellites, that what I talked about before, that do remote sensing, that they take pictures on Earth. You know who they go to? NOAA. The National Atmospheric Administration, the Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. NOAA, that takes care of these. They have a small office to give you a license if you want to do remote sensing. That's it. Nobody else. Because that's been the commercial industry since the beginning. That's it. So here we are saying, okay, we want to go to deep space. We want to mine an asteroid. We want to bring it back. So when you get a license to operate, you have to go to the FAA to get a launch license. And the FAA has they have a small office called FAA ASD. And they have what's called the proverbial round table. Nobody's sitting in this round table. But the FAA will get this request to put a satellite somewhere. So they sit down and they ask Department of Defense, is this okay with you? They check it off. Department of Commerce, is this okay with you? They check it off. NASA, is this okay with you? They check it off. White House, is this okay with you? They check it off. And then they go to the Department of State. And the Department of State is the agency in the federal government that deals with all our interactions with the international community, right? They have to make sure we abide by laws and treaties and things of that nature. So everyone generally would say yes, except for the Department of State. Why? Because we don't have a federal agency that authorizes us and continually supervises us. So under international law, although we have a domestic law that says we can do it, there aren't the mechanisms built in that domestic law to tell us how we can do it and how the United States can follow its obligations under international law. So right now, this is only a first step. But there are many more steps to take. So we're constantly talking to Congress right now, and Congress is interested in moving forward in the next possible steps to create an agency that will authorize us and continually supervise us. So this is where we are. What about the international community? Well, anyone hear of the country of Luxembourg? Anyone know where Luxembourg is? It's in Europe. It's a really small country. Most people have never even heard of Luxembourg before. Luxembourg happens to be SpaceX's #1 commercial client. Luxembourg? Luxembourg is the one that brought the entire industry of using satellites for cable TV. Luxembourg. So they have experience with satellites for 20 plus years. So they heard about what we're doing and they said, well, we're the size of Rhode Island. We don't really have much of a domestic industry other than banking and some telecommunications, obviously with satellites. This is interesting. So we started talking to Luxembourg, and they started doing their own research about the possibility of space resources. They passed their own law that not only allows citizens of Luxembourg to go to space and extract these resources, but it also built in the mechanisms to abide by Article 6 of the Outer Space Treaty. So they actually leapt forward. What did that do to the US Congress? I got phone calls. They're like, so what could we do to get this law going so we meet Article 6 obligations? So the US started it. Luxembourg responded. They built a better law. That put pressure on Congress to say, okay, we got to catch up. Now UAE in the Middle East is developing their own laws. And Japan is now developing their own laws. China is getting very interested in space resources because they have a very ambitious space program. So that actually started that one small regulatory step.
What about
India? India? No, that's a separate discussion. They have a bureaucratic mess in India. Bureaucracy in India go hand in hand. They have very advanced space technology. It's really incredible how active they are in space. But bureaucratically, there's absolutely very little commercial space industry there because of the bureaucracy. But they're looking into it. So our argument is this space law, the CSLA, didn't conflict with international law because the same idea of extracting and obtaining resource from an asteroid is the same idea when a fishing trawler goes into the ocean. And when a fishing trawler goes into the ocean and the fisherman catches the fish, they're not claiming the right to that ocean. They're just claiming the right to that fish that they catch. It's the same idea. We're not claiming ownership rights to the entire asteroid. Not at all. That would be appropriation. We're just claiming the right to the material extracted from the asteroid. And that's generally how the international community has responded. There are countries that are not happy about this, but those are the countries that are generally competing today with they have geopolitical issues with the United States. But these are larger discussions that DSI is actually having with the UN and with these nations. So this is a law that's starting. It's just in its infancy. It's going to be around for the next 30, 40 years developing and organically growing. And we talked about these other nations that are getting interested as well. And now you're going to start seeing how nations like the United States and Luxembourg and UAE, they all have these laws. They're going to start talking to each other and create bilateral agreements and multilateral agreements. That way you develop the best practices. Because right now we don't know which technology is best to use. When you land on an asteroid, how do you take it apart? Do you create dust? What about the environmental impacts? What technologies work? What don't? It's hard to regulate an industry that you don't even know what technologies will be useful. So you don't have what's called the standard of care that you're going to need to understand on dealing with these resources. So we're asking Congress and other countries to encourage companies like Deep Space Industries and others for trial and error, to practice on what's going to work on these asteroids, what's going to have the least amount of environmental impact, what's going to have the least amount of safety concerns, and develop those laws and start talking organically that one day, whether it's 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 50 years from now, there will be an international treaty like we saw that just deals with space resources. But we don't have that just yet. So why am I doing this? Well, I have the coolest job in the world because I can say I'm a space attorney and I deal with asteroid mining. So that's pretty cool amongst a lot of the attorneys that I know. Half of them are depressed or suicidal. And it's quite true, so they get a little bit jealous and I enjoy that. Another reason that I'm doing this is because of something called the overview effect. And I don't know how many of you have ever heard about the overview effect. Anyone? So the overview effect was coined by an author named Frank Wright back in the 80s. And what happened was, there was a study that showed the effect of astronauts going to space and what that did to their body. We talked a little bit about that before. But there's also something that happens to many astronauts when they go to space. And for the first time in their life, these are generally, historically, have been fighter pilots, people involved in the military. Now that's changing. It's been changing for quite a while. But these were people that were very gung-ho and very strong and disciplined. So an astronaut on the Apollo mission named Edgar Mitchell had a real experience when he went into space. And when he looked out, and this was a fighter pilot, this was a jock pilot, I mean, Vietnam, people are very strong-willed individuals. When he looked out of the window and he saw Earth, he realized that we're just this little speck, this little ball, dangling in nothingness with a very thin atmosphere for people to breathe. And for a moment, he realized that nationalism, religion, for him, borders, things like that, they didn't mean anything anymore. He had this reawakening, this understanding that everything that he thought was true about the way he perceived himself and the way he perceived others was starting to be questioned. And that's happened to a lot of astronauts. And they started a spiritual journey. Many of them started a spiritual journey right afterwards. And it is my hope that the sooner that we all have the experience of seeing this precious little ball in the earth that we're all dangling on, right? And we realize how life is so fragile, that we start questioning how we viewed ourselves and others. And hopefully, many of us will have a spiritual awakening and realize that life is not just about, and I don't mean to sound cruel or mean, life is not just about nationalism or religion or even the family that you thought, which are all important, but there's something deeper. And we'll realize that the more that we go and explore on the outside, the more we realize that we have to start looking inward. So that's why I'm doing this, and I hope that happens sooner than later, because we need that. Thank you. So I know we're limited on time.
We've got about 12 minutes for questions.
Okay, fantastic. Yes?
Just curious, so I know it seems like a lot of the issues involving, I know your whole entire thing is about working in space and getting the resources from space, but is there any possibility that maybe you could bring the asteroids here? I know it sounds really, I mean, everything when it comes to space isn't easy, so I guess that's fair to say at the start, but if you could slow them down as you bring them into orbit and bring them to here, could you prevent all of the arguments of who owns it by just landing in our national waters or on land or however you may do it? Couldn't you break all those rules and just, we landed in our piece of land, can't be mad that it's ours now? Like, couldn't
Do
you?
you want to talk with Deep Space Industries? I'm looking for someone to go to Congress with me. Yeah. It's a good question. So technologically, it's a technological challenge, right? To bring a large asteroid and bring it back to Earth's orbit. It's going to happen. The question is, how close can you come without potentially endangering somebody or endangering operations in space, International Space Station, or, oops, it kind of slipped back into Earth's gravity and this thing is really big and it creates a lot of destruction. So I would say until such time that the technology is going to be vetted out and created, we don't want to do that, right? But there will come a time where asteroids will be pulled into what's called Lagrange points. So a Lagrange point is a spot between, there's L1, L2, it's a spot between, let's say, the Earth and the Moon, where if you put an object there, it'll stay there, right? Because of the gravitational pull between the Moon and the Earth, or the Earth and the Sun. And that's kind of like a station keeping, and you could do things there. And it's far away enough from the Earth that you don't have to worry about it. But if you're going to expand beyond Earth's orbit, if you're going to go beyond the moon's orbit, you probably not want to take that asteroid back. You'll probably want to process it there and create whatever you want to create in that location. But there will come a time where we'll start pulling those asteroids back. We're not there technologically, but we're certainly not there politically or legally. It's a hot button that, you know, baby steps. You have to vet the technology, and you have to allow people to acclimate to these changes, and you can't do that overnight, and that's going to take some time.
Now, have the people that you said were in the billionaire club have seen like the resources you can gain from asteroids and are starting to invest in something like this, or is it just that they're just going for just the space travel itself and colonization of Mars?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So all of them, whether it's Bezos or Paul Allen from Stratolaunch, or especially Elon Musk, they're all aware of DSI and several others. And there's less actually than 5 companies throughout the world that are doing this. Maybe 2 or 3 that are kind of serious about it. We're talking about really nobody yet. I mean, it's brand new. It's in its infancy. They're focused on on rockets. And that takes a lot of bandwidth. And you know, part of the beauty of it is hopefully companies like DSI and others will vet out the technology and will build the technology to such a degree that they'll either buy us or use us or license some of our technologies. But that's not their focus. But they all acknowledge, especially Elon Musk. He said it recently at the International Aeronautical Congress in Australia this year. He said it last year in Mexico, that this is not going to be able, he's not going to be able to, colonize is a horrible word, right? Because it's a very touchy word. He's not going to be able to settle Mars unless he can use space resources. There's no way you're going to have habitation that's going to be allowable with resources that you take just on a spacecraft. So they've all acknowledged that you need space resources. They're not going to get into that right now because they're focused on rockets.
Yeah, how is he bouncing around that? Like, not saying colonizing Mars, but...
Oh, he says colonizing. He doesn't really care. But I'm kind of sensitive about it, yeah.
I had a question. I was wondering if you could give us a timeline from now to the first asteroid mine to the construction of the first settlements. It's kind of two-part. Also, when these settlements are made, I was wondering how would they be classified? Would they be classified as U.S. territory, research settlements, or sovereign colonies or settlements?
So the timeline. Let me take out my magic ball. We don't know. We don't know like what it's going to look like between now and that time where you saw those big processing plants. That could be anywhere between 15 to 30 years. Maybe a little bit longer, maybe a little bit less. But the first asteroid mining, like I said, has already been done. But really, the first asteroid mining is probably going to be within the next 3-4 years. And what does that look like? That means actually going to an asteroid, landing on an asteroid, and that's not easy, right? Because these things are 3-dimensional, and they're twisting and rolling, and you have to get the spacecraft to roll with them, and then you have to land on them, and there's rocks and boulders. That's not an easy feat. But we're going to do that within 3 years. In 2020, we're launching our first spacecraft. 2021, we're launching our first spacecraft. That spacecraft will be able to pick up some of that material from the surface. That's mining. Maybe it's not the mining that we think about, but that's mining. And that we're going to return that back to Earth, hopefully within the next 5 to 10 years. Now, in terms of settlement, what was the settlement question again?
I was wondering how would they be classified? Would it be classified as U.S. territory, research settlements, or sovereign settlements?
No territory, because there's no colonization of space. You can't appropriate. So that's the question. What would they be classified under? There right now is a question mark.
So we're going to get there.
We're going to get there. We have to deal, there's discussions in the UN what that looks like, but there's a lot of infighting between different countries because one country is certainly, like lesser developed countries or developing countries that don't have that space technology don't want to be left behind. So they're trying to hold back, and I understand there's concern and there's fears. It's really about reaching out and showing them how they can benefit, how their citizens can benefit. This is not just about American industry. This is about the science and the technology that we learn from these missions that can be used by everybody, including their own space agencies. Yeah.
All right, so you talk about NEAs. So we know where they're at, and as we get there and start to mining, what is the mission that they're going to do to bring it back? Are we going to have enough fuel? Are we going to use the water thrusters that we were talking about to bring that back?
So the first missions, our first mission that I was talking about, what we call the prospector mission, is really about prospecting. It's really about landing on, it's showing the world that a commercial company can actually do it. And we could do it for a fraction of the price of what NASA or JAXA could do. Their mission is about $1 billion. Our mission is going to be a lot less, maybe 20 times cheaper. And it's about actually proving that a commercial company could do it. And we'll pick up some of the material and we'll bring it back. How much material we bring back and what that material looks like, we just don't know right now. But that's going to be within the next 4 years. Yes?
Couple questions. So, once you're all up and running with all the materials and everything, would you be processing the materials in space or bringing them down and then putting it back up?
The whole point is, whatever's in space stays in space.
Okay.
So all the processing is done in space for local use.
And then one more thing, I don't know much about like how orbits work, but is there a possibility of once you start messing with the shape and size of these asteroids that they lose orbit and come down to Earth? Is there that danger, or is that not even possible?
That's a concern that's been voiced by a lot of scientists throughout the world. So we have to be very sure that the NEA that we choose is one that's not going to be within a close range to Earth's orbit, that we can start practicing and experimenting far away enough that there's no concern. So, so that's an issue that we've dealt with the State Department, we've dealt with internationally, because a lot of people have those questions. Yes?
For all the different companies that are exploring space or wanting to explore space, do you think that they're more like independent and in like a competition with each other, or is it more like what you're saying, they work together and they bring different technologies to each other and they all kind of succeed?
The different companies?
Computational collaboration.
That's a great question. So, it depends on which company you talk to. And it depends on what industry they're in. Because our industry is so young, and there's only about 5 of us, plus or minus, some of us see this as a win-win for everybody. And the technologies that we create, they can use. The technologies that they create, we can use. And because the resources are limitless, there's no issue of competing against one another. But there are some companies who see this as a zero-sum game. If we win, they lose. And we don't see that at all. And there's some nations that see that, and we don't see that at all. So the fun part of my job is going around to different companies and to different organizations and to different nations, showing that how everybody's going to benefit from this. And that's an uphill challenge because there is a lot of competition. But competition is good because it moves people along. It acts as a catalyst to push them harder to develop technologies. Yes?
You mentioned how you plan on using water sources and using water from asteroids to fuel sources. And you also talked about how a big part of what you guys want to do is to refuel satellites. But a lot of this, I'm assuming the satellites don't need water sources because you guys just developed it along. So how do you plan on using it?
It's great question. So we've created what's called a comet thruster. Like I said, it's like a flying steam kettle. It's about this big, right? And then we put them on small spacecraft. So what we're doing is we're selling this to the market. There's companies that are buying this that have their own small spacecraft that they want to use this because it's non-toxic, it's not pressurized. It's the only propulsion system that rocket companies will allow to get on their rocket because they don't want, the other propulsion systems that are very caustic and explosive to be used. So we're developing what's called a closed ecosystem, right? They need water, we're going to extract water, then we're going to refuel it. So what about the satellites today, is your question. So there's other volatiles. There's different gases on asteroids, right? There's methane, and there's the hydrogen that you can use out of the water, and there's different kind of gases that you can process in different ways. Now the question is it easy to process them? Is it economically affordable to process? Can you develop a business case to process all these other volatiles that you can use, store them, transport them back into low Earth orbit or geostationary orbit, and refuel them? And our answer is yes. And we've got the technology, we're starting to develop the technology to do so. Some of them are going to be more difficult than others. There's no doubt about that. Processing water is the low-hanging fruit, it's easy. Processing other fuels is going to be a little bit more difficult, but that's going to be a reality. Yeah, follow up, go ahead.
So you guys mentioned how you want to locally source resources to keep what you mine in space stays in space. And how are you guys going to find everything in space? So that it's
called microgravity foundries. There's going to be, so I don't know if you guys read the papers of what's happening locally. There's a company called Qualcomm. And Qualcomm is going to have a patent lawsuit against Apple. There's lawsuits upon lawsuits about intellectual property violations, right? And there's patents and there's copyrights, there's all sorts of things. There's going to be an entire war. I don't mean to say this, and I hope this doesn't happen, but you'll see conflicts happening just on intellectual property alone. So people are developing, companies are developing these technologies on how do you in microgravity or zero gravity, how do you take apart all these materials? How do you process them? How do you put them back together? How do you transport them? That's going to be the wave of the future of technology that's happening in space. There's going to be entire industries, companies alone, just developing technologies to do microgravity foundry, to do processing. We haven't even started this yet. I mean, we haven't even started any of those technologies. We're just starting the bare bone minimum to get there. That's why you're going to see the next 15, 20 years, that's going to be, the next industrial revolution is going to happen in space.
Do you guys plan on developing your own means to refine these resources in space, or do you plan on contracting with another company?
Yes and yes. Yes, last question.
So, what does the space organizations, including the ones that you're involved with, have planned for the non-state actors, non-governmental organizations, including even terrorist organizations that could take advantage of both the acts that imply that you know, you can go in space, but there's no altercation. So that gives them the incentive to go up there and wreak havoc, you know, in whatever means necessary.
Yeah.
Have you guys discussed any of that?
You're basically saying, how do we avoid conflict?
Exactly.
Great question. So, the good thing about rocket science to a certain degree is it's rocket science. I was about to say the S word. This stuff is hard. All right, that's the reason they call it rocket science is because it's really hard. So, terrorist organizations, unless they, you know, kidnap some of these top-minded rocket scientists, really can't develop their own rockets. Let's start from there. With the technology that they have, they probably don't. And then to launch them is very difficult. Most of the companies that have ever launched a rocket for the first 10, 15 trials, their rockets exploded. It's very difficult. So they don't have the access to the technology, they don't have the access to build it, they don't have the access to launch it. So that's one of the ways. That will change over years. But the other countries that are involved in space are ruled by international law, like Russia, like China, like the US, like any other spacefaring nations. Why? Because of the Outer Space Treaty in 1967. So they all have to abide by it. And if they don't, they go to the World Court. Someone can bring them up to the World Court and have a litigation. That hasn't been done yet. Because so far, everybody's abided by, plus or minus, the Outer Space Treaty. So it's a great question. The question is, when is the technology going to develop to such a degree that state actors and private actors are going to take the limit of the 1967 Outer Space Treaty and test that limit? And that's the question.
All right, unfortunately we're out of time, but let's thank our speaker. If you're one of my astronomy students, please come down and very quickly but clearly write your name on this piece of paper.
What's that?
Were you serious about taking somebody here to go to Congress with you?
Well, I mean, as long as you can make your way there in terms of a budget.
You've got an exam on Thursday.
Yeah, before we do that, let's go work on your exam, but stay in touch with me. I'd love to stay in touch.
Does DSI distinguish between asteroids and comets?